Hey everyone, it's your friendly gaming aficionado, Munis here, and today's video is going to be different than my usual uploads in a very good way. If you read the title, you know that AMD released their new Ryzen 9000 series CPUs, also known as Zen 5, and in today's video we're going to take a look at the new specifications and focus on the Ryzen 9 9900X in particular. Firstly, we can see that AMD delivered on their promise and that the new CPUs will support the existing AM5 socket. Meaning that if you already own a system with this socket, all you need to do is update your BIOS and you can use the new Ryzen 9000 series CPUs. Such BIOS updates are already available from all the big motherboard companies and all the rest should follow soon. Here you can see the new CPU specs. Our CPU has 12 cores and 24 threads, up to 5.6 GHz for max boost and also a 50 watt lower TDP than the previous generation. AMD managed to lower their CPU's temps and power consumption by a great margin, making the CPU's temperature much lower and the performance much higher. In addition, now you don't need a 3060 IO anymore and you can use a much simpler cooling solution. The reviews for the 9700X and the 9600X have already been published on the 7th of August and they're considered the mainstream CPUs. The CPU we'll be benchmarking today is the 9900X, which is one before the top AMD CPU, the 9950X. Since these two are the higher end CPUs, they fit perfectly for gaming but also for work and productivity. It's worth noting that the new AMD CPUs come with a built-in graphics engine, the RDNA 2, which is always good to know in case you would like to start your build with this CPU and add a graphics card later down the road. The most noticeable difference between the new 9000 series and the previous gen is probably the wider bandwidth, allowing the CPU to handle more data simultaneously, reducing the time it takes to access and move data between the CPU and its caches, L2 and L3. This improves the overall performance, especially in tasks that rely heavily on fast access to frequently used data. Let's move to the benchmarks. For our system, we're using the ROG Crosshair X670E, which, as mentioned, has the AM5 socket and is a perfect motherboard for our CPU that will allow us to use its full potential. For the RAM, we have 32 gigs of DDR5 at 6400 megatransfer per second from XPG. We're using two sticks of 16 gigs each to utilize dual channel memory. For the GPU in our build, we're using the ROG Strix Gaming RTX 4080. This GPU will definitely allow us to get great performance in games and softwares with the new 9900X. But for our benchmarks, we use the 4090 just to make sure the performance is not capped by the GPU in any way. For the CPU cooler, we'll be using Assassin 4S WH from Deepcool. This cooler is an absolute unit and will keep our CPU cold during tests. And lastly, all of that hardware needs to go into a fitting case. For that, we have the Antec Full Tower C8 white case. This case has a glass on the front and the side so we can see our build in all of its glory. It has great cable management and enough room for us to work with. Okay, now that we went over all of the parts, let's get to the numbers. First, let's talk about the productivity aspect of this CPU. For Puget's benchmarks, we can see that compared to the last Ryzen 9 generation, there is an average of 10% improvement overall, and in comparison to the 14900K, AMD takes the lead in Photoshop that knows how to take advantage of the higher bandwidth, but in Premiere Pro and DaVinci Resolve, the 14900K is still ahead. In Cinebench 2024, we can see a 17% improvement compared to the last gen Ryzen 7900X in single-core performance and an 11% improvement in multi-core performance. When compared to the 14900K, the two CPUs are neck to neck with Intel taking the lead by 4%. In 3DMark x Spy, we can see that the CPU score for the 9900X is higher by almost 6%, making the overall score higher by 5% compared to AMD's last gen CPU. When comparing the 9900X to the 14900K, Intel's CPU score is higher, making Intel's overall score almost 7% better than the 9900X. And lastly, in Blender, when comparing the two CPUs, we can see that although the 9900X performance is good, it is still behind the 14900K by an average of 11%. Okay, now let's move on to some gaming benchmarks, starting with Cyberpunk 2077. Here we can see that the 9900X performed better than the last gen by 4%, and compared to Intel's 14900K, it performed better by 18%, which is a huge margin. Moving on to Red Dead Redemption 2, we can see that in this game the performance overall is about the same throughout all three CPUs, to the point it's even considered within error margin. Our next game is Shadow of the Tomb Raider, where the 9900X has a 4% better performance than the last gen CPU and has the same performance as the 14900K. The last game we benchmarked is Metro Exodus. Here we can see that the new 9900X CPU is taking the lead, performing better than both CPUs. It has a 7% better performance than the last gen AMD CPU and a 13% better performance than the 14900K. Overall, the average improvement between the last gen and the new Zen 5 AMD CPU is around 6% improvement. Now, there will be some games that will know how to take advantage of AMD's wider bandwidth, but overall there is an improvement. Now, given the fact that all it takes for you to upgrade is a simple BIOS update is fantastic, but unless you're specifically looking to utilize the increased bandwidth, an upgrade might not be necessary if you already have the previous AMD generation. Please note that these benchmarking results are with a new driver. Once more development is done on the new drivers, the result could improve by a few percent, as it was with the previous generations. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please consider liking and subscribing for more content like this in the future. Thanks again for watching. This is Muniz, signing off.